Right. Good afternoon. I'm Minnesota Management and Budget Commissioner Erin Campbell. With me today are State Economist Dr. Anthony Becker and our State Budget Director Anna Minge. Together we'll present the February 2026 Budget and Economic Forecast. I want to begin by acknowledging the work of Dr. Becker and his economic analysis team, as well as Anna Minge and our state budget team and the other staff at MMB and our partner agencies who provide the information necessary to prepare our forecast. As a reminder, Minnesota is one of 13 states that show a 4-year window into our state's budget and economic outlook in our twice-yearly forecasts. That enables us to not only gauge near-term economic conditions, but also to plan for circumstances that may arise in the next biennium. We analyze a large amount of data to prepare our forecasts, and the forecasts represent the best financial projections that we can provide based on the information available when we prepare them. In this forecast, we'll continue to refine our projections for fiscal years 26 and 27, which will provide essential information that policymakers can use in any supplemental budget considerations. We also update our projections for the planning years FY 28 and 29. After our presentation, we'll be happy to take your questions. There is good news in this forecast, but significant risks do remain. Minnesota is in a strong financial position. We now project to end fiscal years 26-27 with a surplus of $3.7 billion, which is $1.3 billion more than forecast in November. Left unspent, that surplus will carry forward into fiscal years 28 and 29. Those funds carrying forward are key to ending the planning years with a positive balance. As a result, we're currently forecasting a $377 million positive balance in FY 28 and 29. The increased projected balance in both biennia is due to a slightly improved national economic outlook, which drives an increase in forecast revenues, particularly in individual income tax and corporate franchise taxes. When it comes to individual income taxes, we're seeing a shift from typical drivers of revenue increases like wage and salary to more volatile sources. Higher wages and more people in the workforce traditionally drive increases in revenue to individual income taxes. And wages do, in fact, continue to rise. However, employment growth is weak, both nationally and in Minnesota, and demographics and changing immigration policies are shrinking the pool of available workers. Instead, what we're seeing now is capital gains and interest earnings, which are sensitive to even small changes in the national economic outlook, propel much of the increase in the individual income tax revenues. As Minnesota becomes more reliant on these revenue sources, we're also seeing and should expect increased volatility. As we've discussed in previous forecasts, we also have seen unprecedented growth in our corporate tax revenues. And while this is generally good news, it's worth noting this has long been our most volatile revenue source. Dr. Becker will discuss this in more detail, but the lack of access to relevant federal data due to the federal government shutdown does have potential implications for our revenue forecast, particularly when it comes to our most volatile revenue sources. In Minnesota, we're also experiencing unprecedented threats to federal funding that we rely on. Any loss of federal funding is problematic, but particularly for entitlements, which would result in significantly increased costs to the state to provide legally required services without benefit of federal aid. The potential implications for the Minnesota budget should not be underestimated. And the structural imbalance, or the amount that spending exceeds revenues, continues to be an issue both in this biennium and the next, and that's even after the improvements to the revenue forecast. I do want to note that the significant actions taken by the governor and the legislature last spring in the enacted FY 26-27 budget have helped drive a positive balance in FY 28 and 29. And while the structural imbalance was not eliminated, it is improved in part due to those budget decisions. This slide shows a projected FY 26-27 budgetary balance for this forecast in the middle column compared to the November estimates on the left. The column furthest to the right shows the difference between the two. At the top of the slide, you'll see that our beginning balance for the current biennium is nearly $10.3 billion. That money represents carry forward from the last biennium. Our revenue estimates for the current biennium are up about $1.2 billion from the November forecast. and spending projections are down $68 million. The projected balance at the end of fiscal years 26 and 27 appears under the lowest horizontal line. As you can see, we now forecast a positive balance of more than $3.7 billion, again, nearly 1.3 million than we had forecasted in November. This slide should look familiar. It shows the forecast horizon and the impacts of one biennium on the next. Before I get into the contents of this slide, it's important to remember that when we started this current biennium in July, we had the benefit of significant carry forward from FY 24 and 25 of $4.8 billion. This is important because we do have a structural imbalance in the biennium that we're currently in of $908 million. That starting balance, less the structural imbalance, leaves us with a projected balance of $3.7 billion. If we look at the screen, we'll start on the column in dark blue to the left. This is showing the $3.7 billion we project to be available at the end of FY 26-27. Left unspent, that money carries forward to become the beginning balance in fiscal years 28 and 29. If we move to the middle column in gold, you can see the projected structural imbalance in FY 28 and 29 of just under $3.4 billion. This is the amount the projected spending exceeds revenues generated in that biennium, plus discretionary inflation of over $1 billion. When you subtract that sum from the $3.7 billion, we're left with what you see in the dark blue column on the right, $377 million at the end of fiscal years 28 and 29. Discretionary inflation is included in the forecast to give policymakers a sense of what it would cost to maintain state services at the current level. If we don't count discretionary inflation, which as a reminder, legislators are not required to budget for, we'd have a projected positive balance of slightly more than $1.4 billion at the end of the planning years. With that, I'd like to invite State Economist Dr. Anthony Becker to the podium to cover our economic and revenue outlook.
Thank you, Commissioner Campbell. I'm Anthony Becker, Minnesota State Economist. Since Minnesota's budget and economic forecast was last prepared in November 2025, the U.S. economic outlook has improved slightly, with higher rates of growth in real gross domestic product, consumer expenditures, and investment, along with a forecast for slightly lower rates of inflation in the near term. However, payroll growth has weakened and trade policy uncertainty continues to cloud the economic outlook. Our macroeconomic consultant, S&P Global Market Intelligence, SPGMI, released their baseline forecast to us on February 6, 2026. Due to the federal government shutdown in October and November and the partial shutdown in early February, certain key data that are typically available for SPGMI's February forecast were not available to them. The data include fourth quarter gross domestic product and its components, corporate profits, and the January 2026 employment situation report. Also missing are consumer prices from October of 2025. On trade, SPGMI assumed an effective tariff rate of 14%, 4 percentage points lower than in November. The recent Supreme Court decision invalidating the IEEPA tariffs happened after SPGMI's forecast release, as did the 10% Section 122 tariffs that the administration announced. In this chart, we have SPGMI's forecast for GDP through the end of the forecast horizon. Here, the overall outlook has improved since November, with higher growth in 25 and slightly higher growth in 26, mostly due to an assumption that strong economic growth in quarters 3 and 4 of 25 would carry forward into 2026. As in November, GDP growth, though, remains below trend in 2027 and beyond. This means that employment demand is unlikely to be robust in the years ahead. Further, a low-growth economy can more easily slip into recession as a result of an adverse external shock. Real personal consumption expenditures, also known as real consumer spending, are the primary driver of growth in the economy, accounting for roughly 70% of GDP. SPGMI now forecasts real consumer spending will grow 2.8% in 2026, 0.7 of a percentage point higher than their November forecast. From 2027 through 2029, real consumer spending is expected to grow 2.2% per year on average. Despite rising incomes, we are observing some signs of consumer stress with higher delinquency rates in certain loans, credit cards, auto loans, and student loans, with delinquency rates now reaching levels comparable to those during the Great Recession. However, home loan delinquency rates remain at historic lows. Compared to the November forecast, inflation is projected to be slightly lower in 2026 and higher from 2027 to 29. Lower near-term inflation reflects a lower assumed average effective tariff rate than in the November forecast, and lower inflation that we experienced in late 2025. Overall, inflation in both the CPI and core personal consumption expenditure indices is expected to remain elevated through 2027 before gradually easing in 2028. Corporate profits are now forecast to grow 9.5% in fiscal year 2026, 7.4 percentage points stronger than projected in November. In FY27 and beyond, corporate profits are forecast to show minimal growth. Minnesota's corporate franchise tax is closely related to the level of corporate profits and is the state's most volatile revenue source. The volatility in this revenue source makes it difficult to forecast with precision. Minnesota's unemployment rate has continued to increase over the past year, both absolutely and relative to the national rate. In December, Minnesota's unemployment rate was 4.1%, up 1.1 percentage points from a rate of 3.0% 1 year ago. Although the unemployment rate has risen, Minnesota's rate remains below the national rate, and the state's job market remains favorable to job seekers, with more vacancies than unemployed workers. While this forecast does not include a recession, we are following labor market conditions closely, as some labor market indicators send early signals of economic contractions and expansions. Traditionally, a significant driver of our individual income tax forecast is the forecast for total wage and salary disbursements, and it is little changed since the November forecast. In this forecast, though, wage income is not what is driving the change in the individual income tax forecast. Rather, the increase is driven by increases in non-wage income, principally in capital gains distributions. SPGMI's forecast of the S&P 500 stock index is one determinant of our forecast for non-wage income. Their February forecast is substantially higher than their November forecast for the S&P 500. In November, they projected a 12% multi-year downward correction in the S&P 500, with the market declining through late 2028. But in the current forecast, they assume a milder correction of only 4% and recovery beginning in 2027. Equity markets present both upside and downside risks to the forecast. If equity markets continue their current upward trends, we will see greater levels of consumer spending and higher non-wage income, both of which will increase state revenues. On the other hand, if we see a substantial decrease in market values of equities, both income and spending would likely fall. So turning to the revenue forecast, the first two columns of the table show the February forecast for the current biennium and the change compared to the November forecast. The second set of columns show the same information for the next biennium. Total revenues for the current biennium are now forecast to be $68 billion, 1.8% more than in the November forecast. We're now projecting individual income tax receipts to be 1.9% more than we projected in November. This increase is primarily due to higher forecasts for individual income tax liability in tax years 25 and 26. The higher tax liability forecast is largely driven by higher forecasts for non-wage income sources, such as capital gains realization, interest income, and IRA distributions. Through January 26, individual estimated tax payments for tax year 25 are $165 million above our November forecast, which is consistent with a higher tax year 2025 liability. Technical adjustments and a higher forecast for net partnership and S corporation collections further contribute to the forecast change. And this is also consistent with stronger collections we've observed through January of this year. General sales tax revenue is now forecast to be nearly $16 billion, 0.5% more than in the current biennium than in the November forecast. This increased forecast reflects a higher forecast for consumer spending on goods and services subject to the sales tax. The corporate franchise tax is forecast to generate $6.6 billion in the current biennium, 5.4% more revenue than in the November forecast. This forecast change is due to the higher corporate profits forecast as shown previously. Other revenues are now forecast to generate almost $10 billion, 1.2% more than in November, due primarily to an increased forecast for investment income, the return the state earns on its cash balances, including the budget reserve. As I noted previously, higher forecasts for non-wage income sources are primary drivers of the higher individual income tax forecast. The non-wage share of gross income reported by Minnesota taxpayers has been increasing over time, and we expect this trend to continue. Non-wage income, such as capital gains and interest income, are more variable from year to year than wage and salary income. With a rising proportion of personal income tax coming from more volatile sources, the overall volatility of income tax collections has increased. Further, over time, the proportion of general fund revenues coming from more volatile corporate tax, franchise tax, has also risen. This adds volatility to the state's revenue collections in total. To turn to forecast risks. First among the risks to this forecast are the policy uncertainties at the federal level, especially regarding trade, tariffs, and immigration. Trade uncertainty may induce businesses and consumers to take on less debt, suppressing both private investment and some forms of consumer spending. Tariffs are mostly passed through to domestic buyers and so also contribute to higher prices and higher input costs for businesses. The administration's immigration policies also produce forecast risk through the potential to create labor shortages in business sectors dependent on immigration for new workers. The recent federal shutdown disrupted the usual collection and dissemination of federal statistical data. The missing data due to the shutdown clouds our picture of economic growth, corporate profits, inflation, and labor market conditions, adding uncertainty to our revenue forecast. It also makes it more difficult to assess the reasonableness of SPGMI's forecasts of inflation and exchange rates. Equity markets present both upside and downside risks, as I've already mentioned. The assumed path of monetary policy depends on both inflation and labor market conditions. Because of the trade uncertainty and weak national employment growth, there's limited clarity about monetary policy through the forecast horizon. The adoption of artificial intelligence provides both upside and downside risks. The upside or positive risk is that through more capital investment, we'll see increased labor productivity, higher wages, and possibly higher employment. The downside risks include the possibility of job losses from AI adoption and the risk that there is an AI investment bubble which may burst. Finally, there are 17 months remaining until the end of the current biennium, and it's difficult to forecast macroeconomic conditions with great precision a year and a half ahead. That ends my portion of the presentation, so I will now turn things over to our State Budget Director, Anna Mingi.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Anna Mingi, State Budget Director at Minnesota Management and Budget. Today, I will be walking through changes in the state expenditure forecast, and then I'll turn it to the Commissioner who will walk through our long-term budget outlook. So this slide outlines anticipated changes in general fund spending in the current biennium as well as our planning years of 2028 and 2029. In total, we project that spending in the current biennium will be $68 million lower than our previous estimates, but the planning estimates have increased by $152 million since our last forecast. Let me walk you through the table to give a better sense of what's driving that change. The first line, E12 education, spending is above prior estimates by $111 million this biennium and $257 million in the next. These increases are a result of higher spending for special education, where costs have grown as school districts spend more to deliver services to our students. Health and Human Services spending is projected to be $162 million below previous estimates this biennium and $199 million lower in the next. This reduction is largely driven by the implementation of new payment review processes in the Medical Assistance Program, which I will discuss in greater detail in a moment. On the next line, you can see the property tax aids and credits spending is $18 million below previous estimates in this biennium, largely as a result of lower spending on property tax refunds. Spending for debt service and all other areas of the budget are virtually unchanged from previous estimates. On the next line, you can see that our forecast includes an estimate of discretionary inflation. We estimate this cost to be $1.04 billion, which is $104 million more than we forecast in November. This change is due to a slightly higher forecast for the Consumer Price Index, which can have a large budgetary impact because it's applied on such a large base of spending. As a reminder, this number is not meant to be a specific accounting every single inflationary pressure in the budget. Rather, it is a guide for policymakers about the cost of maintaining current services as prices grow. Any increases need to be appropriated by the legislature. They don't automatically flow to state programs unless the program has a specific statutory formula that directs it. So policymakers have the choice whether or not to spend this line item to address those inflationary pressures. So now let's move on to the next slide to discuss some key changes within our spending forecast. As you just heard, special ed is responsible for the upward revision in our education forecast. These costs have increased by $112 million this biennium and $350 million in the next relative to where we were in November. That is on top of the significant increases that we incorporated in the November forecast of $133 million in 26-27 and $287 million in 2028 and 2029. Today's increases are because we now have complete data about what schools spent on special ed services in the 2024-25 school year. Special ed service spending grew by about 10% last year compared to the 6% that we assumed would grow in the previous forecast. The annual rate of growth for school special ed spending has grown significant in recent years, driving revisions in the state forecast. So the chart on this slide shows actual and forecast state general fund special ed spending from 2020 through 2029. During this time period, we project that special ed spending is projected to grow from $1.6 billion in 2020 to $3.6 billion in 2029. When you look at that on an annual growth perspective, from 2020 through 2023, state general fund spending on special ed grew about 5% on average annually, but from 25 through 29, that rate grows to about 9.5% a year. Some of these changes can be attributed to legislative changes that affect special ed, but overall growth in local education agency spending continues to rise forecast over forecast. And that's really evident on this slide when you look at the previous forecast that we have marked in those dotted and dashed lines. You can see from the end of the 2023 legislative session is the bottom line, then the end of the 2025 legislative session, and finally November 2025 session. So in each of these cases, we've revised our forecast upward to account for higher actual spending sort of at the local level. Now let's move on and talk about a driver of the change in the human services forecast. So this forecast is the first to incorporate the experience that we have with the new prepayment review process for certain medical assistance benefits. In late October 2025, the Minnesota Department of Human Services announced a new process to suspend and review claims for 14 high-risk Medicaid benefits. This was intended to give the agency additional time to identify suspicious patterns and anomalies. DHS contracted with a third party for this review and has established an ongoing prepayment review process for these services. This process has impacted the forecast in 3 ways, which are sort of depicted in the chart on the screen. So what the chart shows is the forecast savings attributable to the prepayment review process. The most immediate impact, in the dark blue on the slide, is the delay in the payment of fee-for-service claims of 2 weeks. This additional review takes time, and as a result, the claims are paid just 1 billing cycle later than they would have otherwise. And because everything is pushed out by 2 weeks, there is just a one-time savings reflected in the forecast. But the most significant impact of the prepayment review process comes from the fact that we are receiving fewer bills from providers. Some have referred to this as cost avoidance. Through an analysis of claims from both before and during the implementation of prepayment review, DHS estimates about 4% lower spending in these 14 services as a result of providers simply billing less. This cost avoidance is expected to decrease state spending by $75 million this biennium and $99 million in the next. This estimate is based on actual experience in the most recent quarter, and it's not an explicit measure of fraud. It may indicate that there's a deterrent effect of the new prepayment review process, but it might also be capturing savings related to broader conditions in both the service delivery sector or the broader economy. The third forecast impact of the prepayment review process is the denial of claims that would have been otherwise paid if not for the review. In this process, claims for the impacted benefits are reviewed using targeted analytics and then flagged if suspicious. So if a claim is identified for further review, it's sent to DHS staff who reviews it and decides either to approve or deny. Based on early data, DHS projects an increase in denials, which reduces state spending by $5 to $6 million a biennium. So in total, the incorporation of this experience lowers the spending forecast by $133 million this biennium and $105 million in the next. So now let's move on and talk about something that is not in the forecast. So as we've discussed in previous forecasts, federal funds are a very important piece of the state budget. Federal funds make up about 1 in every $3 spent by state agencies. What MMB pays particular attention to, though, are federal funds that support state-level entitlements, programs where the state has an obligation under our laws to provide service to individuals regardless of federal funding levels. We estimate these dollars make up about 2/3 of the funds we receive from the federal government. In these cases, losses of federal funds create a direct budgetary impact to the state. Federal funding for entitlement programs has been more volatile in recent months as a result of both federal law changes and administrative action, and there are several risks that are not reflected in today's forecast. One example is related to actions taken by the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, also referred to as CMS, which is the federal agency overseeing Medicaid. On January 6th, CMS indicated their intent to withhold $515 million per quarter from the state's MA reimbursement. That action is currently pending appeal, and the loss of federal funds is not reflected in our estimates today. And now, just earlier this week, we received additional notice from CMS that they would defer $260 million of our Medicaid reimbursements pending further information from the state to justify claims that they flagged. There is also budgetary risk from the fact that some of our state laws do not comply with federal law that passed over the summer. Specifically, H.R. 1, the Federal Reconciliation Bill, made a number of changes, some of which must be implemented by January 1st of 2027. An example of that would be work reporting requirements for Medicaid. If state law is not amended to comply with this change, we stand to lose significant federal funds supporting this program. Unfortunately, we don't have the guidance today to quantify the magnitude of this risk, but we understand that it could be significant and could change our budget outlook. There have also been recent attempts by the federal government to freeze funds supporting child care benefits and MFIP. And although none of these impacts are currently reflected, if they occur, it could dramatically alter our current budget outlook. With that, I'll turn it back to Commissioner Campbell.
All right, thank you, Anna. This slide shows the long-term budget outlook. It compares our forecast revenues against our estimated spending for the current biennium and the next. And that's without including any unspent projected balances or transfers to the reserve. This is what we call our structural balance. As you can see, forecast revenues of $67.5 billion in the current biennium are expected to grow by $2.5 billion in the next, an annualized growth rate of 1.9%. During that same period, we are expecting baseline spending of $68.4 billion to increase by nearly $4 billion, or 2.9% on an annualized basis in the FY 28-29 biennium. If you include appropriation carryforward and discretionary inflation, total spending is projected to exceed $70.2 billion in this biennium, growing by $3.1 billion to a total of $73.4 billion in the planning years, an annualized growth rate of 2.2%. So if we take a step back, when we subtract total forecasted spending in the planning biennium from expected revenues in that same period, you end up with a structural imbalance of nearly $3.4 billion, or $2.3 billion if you don't include discretionary inflation. Despite tremendous progress in the last legislative session, more work is needed to address the ongoing structural imbalance to align revenues and spending. You can see on this slide how our budget reserves have grown over the years, thanks to our nation-leading reserve policy. With the addition of $244 million last November, our total cash flow and budget reserve remains at a record high of $3.8 billion. Those reserve dollars not only protect us against an unexpected loss of revenues in the current biennium, they also help us maintain our AAA bond ratings and our reputation as a financially well-managed state. As I close, I want to reinforce that the state of Minnesota is on strong financial footing. We have a very healthy projected balance in FY 26-27 of nearly $3.7 billion on the bottom line. And despite persistent structural imbalances, we expect to end this biennium and the next with a positive balance. And that's a big improvement from November, particularly in FY 28 and 29. Additionally, we have our nation-leading automatic allocation to our reserve, which means that we have the funds to address an unexpected revenue shortfall. And just a note here that in light of Minnesota's increased dependence on more volatile revenue sources, there may be adjustments needed to the budget reserve target level to better capture those heightened risks in the future. We also have our AAA bond rating that demonstrates rating agencies' continued confidence in Minnesota's responsible financial management and our history of taking actions to keep the state on sound financial footing. And we also have time to address the structural changes needed to bring spending and revenue in line in order to avoid a future fiscal crisis. Still, it will be important for policymakers to keep a few things in mind as they make decisions this legislative session. First, the volatility of the revenue that's driving the forecast improvement. In particular, in light of the relevant macroeconomic data that did not arrive in time to be included in this forecast. Even the most recently released GDP and corporate profits data could have meaningful impacts on available revenues. As we've mentioned, continued federal funding uncertainty could have impacts on our general fund bottom line. And as we know, any new spending this biennium will impact the projected positive balance of $377 million in FY 28 and 29. And finally, structural imbalance does continue to be an issue. Alignment of spending and revenue will need to be addressed. The sooner we begin looking for additional ways to do that, the less likely we are to face a future fiscal cliff. Given these considerations, it's our recommendation that policymakers should, at a minimum, strongly consider offsetting any new spending with spending reductions to be mindful of both the FY 28-29 projected balance and the structural imbalance. I do want to once again acknowledge the important work done last legislative session that did have a material impact on this forecast. That fiscal discipline will remain important in this legislative session and the next. As always, MMB will continue to watch for significant changes through our monthly revenue updates, our quarterly economic updates, our close monitoring of federal actions, and we'll be providing that information to the legislature and to the public so that they can anticipate and respond to economic changes. And with that, we are happy to take your questions.
Commissioner, can you talk more about the immigration action? We've heard about possible labor shortages, but what about workers staying home, businesses permanently closing, temporarily closing? What kind of impact does that have?
At this point, we don't have the data that would be necessary it's not ultimately included in this forecast. The data is not available on that at this time.
What kind of uncertainty or fears do you have about not having that data?
I think that it's fair to say that we are concerned about the potential impacts of all of that. We don't know how it's going to impact how that data will ultimately drive revenues and the data that we ultimately use to identify what revenues will be available in this forecast. And so it's a little bit too soon to say, but it certainly doesn't seem like it's going to be favorable. In terms of the federal funding and yeah. Well, take for example the $260 million that the federal government highlighted just 2 days ago. If that came to pass, that money would need to come off of the bottom line, and it would reduce the available balance in FY28 and 29 by 2/3. And so that's just one example of the variables that we can't include in this forecast at this time, and the real impact that it could have on the forecast. And the reality is that it wouldn't take much to have $377 million in a positive balance end up being a negative number in the next few months.
Why doesn't MMB include these variables in the forecast that you were talking about, almost $3 billion a year potentially in Medicaid, child care money? Why does this forecast not even put that into the estimates?
So what we put in the forecast is based on current law. These things have not yet come to pass. When they do, we include them. Because they've not come to pass, we identify them as risks and talk about them in that way.
What do you make of the federal record? What do you make of the sense of consumer stress that home loan delinquency rates are remaining low, but you started to see the credit card? Is that going to spill over into the home loans, or how can we try to explain that?
So, yes, we have seen rising delinquency rates in credit cards, in auto loans, and in student loans. Student loans, pretty easy to explain. A lot of COVID-era relief measures have terminated. And the delinquency rates have risen essentially to where they were pre-pandemic. And then also, they had been fairly steady at a high level out of the Great Recession. Credit cards and auto loans, it's going to take some more analysis to really figure out why delinquency rates there are higher. And that analysis would involve looking at the characteristics of the households that are entering delinquency. But it is likely because of this term that's been popular lately, the K-shaped economy, where people at the top end of the income distribution are doing well and people in the middle and lower half of the income distribution are not doing so well. So these delinquencies in all likelihood, as they usually are concentrated in the lower ends. And so more than likely what's going on is that we have, this K-shaped thing going on, and that part of the income distribution, people are not, they're feeling the affordability crisis and so forth. And so that would be my best take on this for right now. Yes, ma'am.
The prior data, I'm guessing that's only going to get worse once new data comes in. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, I was referring to the general policies of both restricting immigration enforcement, restrictions on H-1B visas, and so forth, that it is likely that those restrictions on immigration will have an adverse effect on the national economy, but Minnesota in particular. Much of our labor force growth over the last several years has been because of international immigration. Now, in the last year, we actually did see a gain from net national migration, which is great for our labor force, but that was the first time that it happened since 2018. But on the international front, yes, I think there will probably be reduced labor supply in a number of areas. Thank you. I would say that fiscally we are in very good shape. We have the AAA bond rating. We have a legislature and a governor who work together to reduce the structural deficit, which puts us with increased revenues in, I think, a very favorable position going into the next biennium. You know, it's hard to compare us with a state like North Dakota, which is highly dependent on natural resources. But I would say that Minnesota's economy tends to be more resilient because it is more balanced and more reflective of the national economy, that we're not fully dependent on, let's say, agriculture like Iowa is more highly dependent on agriculture, not fully dependent, but North Dakota is highly dependent on extractive industries and so forth. So I think we're able to weather storms better, and that we also are poised for growth sooner.
So in terms of the prepayment review process, the immediate, or one immediate impact is that there's sort of a permanent delay as it takes time for, the third party and DHS to review claims. So claims can't get paid quite as quickly. And we just assume it's sort of like we take one billing cycle and move it into the next year, and then that year we take that last billing cycle and we push it out. So this is we assume it's just a one-time savings as everything just gets pushed out a year, or pushed out 2 weeks, and every year just has a 2 week shift in and 2 weeks shift out. So the question about the cost avoidance, through an analysis of claims for the 14 services before and during the implementation of the prepayment review process, it appears that we are receiving about 4% fewer bills, or less in billing dollars, than we did prepayment review process. And that's just assumed to be sort of continuous through the forecast horizon. That is, we can't speak exactly to why that's happening, just what we're seeing in the data. It might be driven by a deterrent effect, knowing that this review is happening, but also there are other things going on in the world at any given point in time.
What do you make of that spike in special ed?
So we've been talking about special ed a lot, probably every forecast. We have seen what is happening is that districts, charters, co-ops, so local education partners, based on the cost that they experience, that then drives what the state, largely we reimburse them for the majority of their costs. And so in 24-25, back in the November forecast, we had partial data that suggested costs were growing about 6%. And then when we got the rest of districts reporting, it turned out that costs actually grew 10%. There are a few things that are contributing to that change. So most of it is that most special ed spending is on payroll and fringe costs for personnel, and that is like growing over time. I think that the cost of labor just is growing, and sometimes there's a lagged effect from some of the inflation that we've experienced in recent years. There's also a major driver is special ed transportation costs, which is something that we talked about last year a fair amount as well. And then there's another program called ADSIS, which stands for the Alternative Delivery of Specialized Instruction Services, which is also mostly staffing costs. It's designed to provide interventions to assist students to avoid them needing more intensive services. And applications for that program is up significantly as well.
We are at time, everybody.
No, so the question is about what's the pre and post comparison for prepayment review. Let me just confirm and get back to you.
Thank you, everybody. The report says that the forecast does not include any impact of CMS's communicated intent to enroll $515 million per quarter in federal matching funds for fraud. Depending on how the state's appeal goes, what could the forecast impact be there?
So I think in general, if we lose, we don't know when the withholding would start. We don't know how many quarters would be withheld. So it's hard to say for certain, but a loss of $515 million in federal funding would mean an increase in state spending of $515 million. So on an annualized basis, that's about $2 billion. If you subtract, it'd be a $2 billion lower surplus this biennium, and then a $2 billion lower balance out in the tails because that money carries forward. So our projected balance in 28-29 would flip to a projected shortfall. That's right.
Well, good afternoon, and the picture fits. It does feel like spring. First of all, a thank you to Commissioner Campbell and all the staff over at MMB for the continued work, to Budget Director Mingy and your team, and to Dr. Becker. Thank you for taking on this work and providing us good data. Look, it's good news day. Minnesota's economy continues to be one of the most resilient and diverse in the country. We've had disciplined budgeting help protect Minnesotans from a lot. Over the last 7 years, I guess, between global pandemics, global economic turndowns, tariffs, Operation Metro Surge, and the Trump administration's continued retribution against Minnesota, we've weathered those things. Our goal is to keep Minnesota on solid financial footing, ready to handle whatever comes. We've worked to do the things that were necessary, and it's not easy. And I said I'm going to be putting out a very, I think, measured supplemental budget in the next month. But I will continue to say this. We have made the pledge that we wanted to make Minnesota the best place in the country for a family to live. We wanted to make it a place where people are able to achieve their dreams. We don't have a budget year this year, but we have important work to do. Yesterday, we rolled out again, as we have for several years now, a more comprehensive package around our continued fight, which we're seeing great returns in, of protecting these incredible programs that we're getting incredible results from. Tuesday, we introduced a proposal to keep Minnesotans safe with a gun violence prevention package. We'll do more of that, but my budget will come out next month. But what I'd like to say is, budgets are not just fiscal documents, they're moral documents. They reflect what you care about. And we made a case to make this the best state in the nation. And in the 2023 session, we had policies like child tax credit. We made major investments in education, paid family and medical leave program that's now entering its third month, and public safety infrastructure, as well as incentives to business growth. Those things, for the first time in almost a decade, we've seen immigration, and Minnesota is one of the few states in the upper Midwest that saw a population increase from immigration, not including outside immigration, that is inside the country. And then I'll go ahead and say what I've been saying all along since last June. Some of the finest work, legislative work and policy work and budget work that I've been associated with was what we were able to accomplish in the last legislative session. That was a split, a dead-on split legislature, Democrats, Republicans working together to make sure that we were continuing to provide what was necessary to make Minnesota an incredibly generous and caring state, but at the same time do so in a fiscally responsible manner, not just in our immediate responsibility, but doing the work that very few states do, over the horizon, including inflation. And I have to think that in a different political world 30, 40 years ago, we would all be standing up here together. A huge thank you to the legislative leaders, Democrats and Republicans, who did that hard work last year. And we're in this position we're in right now because that was done. Now, there is more to be done. We know that we started to rebalance some of the things we needed to rebalance, but some of you have already pointed out, and we have noted this. Very important programs, things that are our responsibility to take care of, like special education. We still have to figure out how to make sure that those costs are contained in a way that we're delivering the services, but yet they're not outstripping what the budget can take. And again, weathering things that come in an economy, whether it's a storm damage, whether it was a global pandemic, I think the thing that, for me, that is very frustrating is when there's things that were totally avoidable that are hurting our economy, like tariffs, and of course, like Metro Surge, and then this totally unconstitutional and a violation of states' rights for absolutely no reason, this threat to withhold money. And, you know, just when you've got the director of CMS telling you, well, the state can just use their rainy day funds, well, you're wrong. If you're going to say those things, you're going to be the budget. At least understand how the states work. Not only is it horrific to try and say that because it's our money, it's horrific because a generalization that there's fraud in that program when their own data shows that the error rate in Minnesota is 2.1%. The national average is over 6%. We're actually one of the more secure states. We've had people steal from us. We put them in jail. We continue to tighten those up. But this budget forecast and the work that we've done, whether it's being AAA bond rating or being able to show continued surpluses while at the same time giving tax cuts to the middle class, this is smart policy. And I go back to this again. This policy, if left in place as we're doing it, we're going to see numbers reducing childhood poverty rates. Again, we're going to see an influx of people moving here. We're going to see an increase, which we've seen, of job creation and job survivability, all at the same time people experience in their own life really important programs like paid family and medical leave, access to college education, free school meals, all of the things that we care about. So really grateful for all the work. I hope it sets the tone. Because I don't think there's a lot of states were able to do what we were able to do collectively, bipartisanly, last legislative session. If we carry that same spirit over, while not as extensive in a budget year, we can get some good things done. So with that, I'd take some questions. Yeah. Well, I think it'll be measured. The question was, with a lot of new spending. I think we have to be very careful. That's where I was last year. And I think many of you know the actual budget I put out actually called for more cuts than we ended up agreeing to, but that's part of this process. I'm going to, just like this team has, and I think it's wise, there's a lot of unknown variables here. I just have to be candid with you. I don't necessarily see this administration stopping this attack on Minnesota that they've done. I do see the court siding with us and us winning. But those uncertainties can be enough. So I'm going to call for this. We've got work to do. As I said, we've got important policy thing. I am going to make my pitch that I think collectively, all of us together, a top priority is to get the bonding bill done. Make sure we're able to do that. That's always very bipartisan. It has to be. So I think that's going to be our priority. But I think you will see limited expenditures. I'll get that out next month. And I will credit again bipartisanly Republican House leadership with Paul Torkelson was, I think, pushing very hard for upgrades to our legacy systems that are now proving to be one of the big sticking points, both in accuracy of delivering of services and, quite honestly, of slowing down the work that needs to be done in the counties. And I'm going to make the case, I don't think we'll probably get that thing all tackled this year, but I think set us on a path. That was some good leadership. It was bipartisan. Zach Stevenson and Paul Torkelson worked really hard on that. I think that's something I hope we see again.
Governor, there was evidence complaints denied or delayed. There were some numbers. Did you ask how much fraud was in the forecast or the budget?
Well, I think it's hard to tell that these folks would tell you the correlation between that. I do think you're seeing savings. And I want to be careful on this because I know that, a denial of claims and a slowing down of those claims, we're always trying to balance out a state that these systems were set up to deliver services. They weren't set up to deny services. And we've talked about this a lot of making sure we're in balance between the two. I think it's clear from the fraud that did happen that we needed to do more. And I think what you're seeing is hopefully striking that proper balance. Because I am deeply concerned too that, there are those that their answer to stopping fraud is to cut the program. Well, the reason we have such a great state and we're having people move in and we're seeing surpluses is because we have these programs. But I think it's too early to tell, but I do think getting that data and staying on it, I know Anna talked a little bit about it. We think there's evidence to show that it's happening.
And you mentioned people move in. Are you concerned about labor shortages? That was mentioned.
Yes. Well, I think Dr. Becker's talked about that, and I think all of us is. And the immigration piece is one we have to solve. And again, the overly simplistic and quite honestly disingenuous argument that if you don't want to see this massive, ridiculous, aggressive, unconstitutional attack we saw, well, you just don't care if there's bad people on the streets. No, I want you to go after the bad people. I want you to go after the people who shouldn't be here and are the worst of the worst. But what I want you to do is what should have been done 2 decades ago. We need comprehensive immigration reform across America because we have a shrinking population and we're going to need that growth. So. Well, I will let the team talk here. Actually, if we didn't spend anything, I do believe now that that is a $377 million bottom line if we carry over. Is that correct?
Yes, that is, we have a positive balance on the bottom line projected at this point in 28 and 29. We do have the structural imbalance that needs to be addressed at some point.
So what I would say is that I think we moved massively, and this number changed dramatically, and it's economics, so it's pointing to everything. But we knew this was coming. We knew we were out of balance. We knew we could still deliver services to the highest level of any state in the country and still show savings. We made a good move on that. I am convinced if we stay on this track, if we give our counties or figure out a better way that we're delivering these services, if we give a modernized, get away from that old legacy system of how we do these benefits and put in the things in the program that we're putting forward on prepayment verification and all of that, I think what you're going to see is you saw spending going down. I think you can continue to do that and still get the level of services. But I would caution again, we tackled a big chunk of that. We did not tackle it all, which was good because we started early enough. I think we take another bite out of it this time. And when in 2027, when the budget year comes up, I think we're much, much better prepared to handle it. Yeah.
And there's been some discussion, it seems like Republicans and Democrats both think that should be a priority, but that it would be quite costly.
Yeah, it will be.
So are you concerned about the cost of that if we do still have this imbalance?
Yeah. Yes, the question is really good. It's about the IT infrastructure, especially for social services delivery. I went down to Dakota County with county commissioners down there and they put me through said, here's an application, you do it, Governor, how to put it through. It's as antiquated as you can possibly imagine, and it's prone with the ability to make errors. Our people and the county people do an incredible job with it. But these legacy systems, this thing dates back. Nobody wants to do this. It's incredibly expensive. It's incredibly hard. And we've just kept patching that thing down the line. It's going to have to be fixed. So I'm willing to work with the legislature. I think we need to take a bite out of it. What I think we need is a multi-year plan on budgeting to tackle that, working hard. And then I think we're learning a lot, reorganizing. We made progress. I think some of us forgot about this. This is not new that DHS was too big, too unwieldy. So we broke it apart to try and get a better view into that. There is more work to be done, so I think a reorganization around DHS, I think those are bipartisan things that we agree with, continue to do so. Yeah.
You, stated this week that a comprehensive drug plan and also a comprehensive product plan. Do you have any ballpark estimate at this point how much those packages cost?
I don't actually on that one, and I can get it to you. I think they're relatively close to budget neutral, and we'll get back to them. So I don't think there's a lot of spending in those packages. Hopefully we should see savings in both of those. The fraud obviously is one.
Governor, one of the areas that looks like it's spending growth in the forecast is special education.
Yeah.
Is there anything that
These are fundamental services that we have both a moral and a legal obligation to provide. And when we're talking about curbing the cost, we're talking about being more efficient. We're talking about better ways of doing it without saying this group of folks is a burden on our budget and we need to cut them down. That's the wrong way to approach it. I do think there are things that we could do there. I don't think, and I said it last year, I don't think we're getting all of the efficiencies. And we talked about this. I would just want to say, just for an example of helping counties out, and this is kind of, I wouldn't call it unintended consequences, but it's like squeezing the balloon and it comes out somewhere else. We reduced the cross subsidies of making sure we were getting money to them, getting to the city, to each of the school districts. But by us picking up the cross subsidy, perhaps there are programs being delivered that would have been thought differently if that wasn't there. And I just say that this is a fundamental Democratic and Republican idea that we should try and be as efficient as we possibly can. And I think in some of these areas, there are savings that can be found without having any negative impact on the folks we care about and seeing a savings. But I am concerned about it. I made this analogy last year that from one biennium to the next, just the increase in special ed transportation funding, just that piece of the special ed, was actually bigger than the entire DNR budget. So people say you need to cut government to save that. We could cut all of the DNR, every single thing they do, every person over there, every job, every state park, everything. And in 2 years, the savings we would have saw would have been eaten up by the transportation cost in special ed. We're going to have to figure that out. Yes.
Governor, this week we're receiving lots of federal dollars be paused. What ways are you going forward or coming up with your recommendation to the legislature? What message do they have to deciding how to spend that money? Is there a big concern?
Yeah, be fiscally conservative. Focus on the things that make a difference. Focus on the things that are growing our economy, that are creating the surplus, that are improving people's lives. But be very thoughtful. Look, this is I'll be generous. This is an unpredictable federal government. What I really need is, and I don't know if I heard it yesterday, it shouldn't be that difficult for every legislator to say, this is the wrong way to approach this. You don't just throw this out there. You don't have the director of CMS said the state can pick it up, which is not true. It doesn't work, not to mention we're a donor state. And I need Republican legislators to ask the federal government to not do these type of things. And I expect those same Republican legislators here to ask us to find savings. And I want to work with them on that. But I think my guidance would be, and it's the way we're going to approach it from our office, this is good news. Minnesota's policies are working. They're making a difference, but it's not as solid as it can be. And I think over the horizon, because it's my goal, I'm going to leave the state in good shape. I'm going to leave the state, again, with historic budget reserves, with budget surpluses, and programs that are functioning like paid family medical leave the way they should, that are actually growth to the economy. So I think we need to be cautious. The legislature is an independent branch. They will come up with the things that they want to get done. But I have to tell you, it was spectacular work last year to be able to get there. Very hard. People took votes they didn't want to. Do we at this time? Well, we're not out yet, so we're still talking about it. I think the goal is where it's, and those small things, whether they're tab fees or types of things that we're doing, we haven't worked through it all yet. But I think what you can expect is the budget will be relatively modest across the board, both in terms of new spending or if there are potential revenue streams. We have to tackle it. We'll see. We're not an automatic tax conformity state, and the big, beautiful bill has lots of things in there that we have to figure out what conformity is going to look like. I think a lot of states are grappling with that in this session. You know, and I would if the folks were here to hear this, I would just my experience of working in Congress, and when you're dealing with CMS on an appeal, 12 to 18 months is not unusual. And am I speaking out of turn there?
I don't think we know what the timeline is.
Yeah.
But we're not.
Yeah, but here's the thing. Again, to my friends in the Republican caucuses, ask them that this is not really wise. And I would ask you again, and there wasn't a single thing. What is the specific fraud in Medicaid that you believe taking away health care from 400,000 children, pregnant women, and seniors makes this move a good move to fix this, rather than the data-driven moves we're making that are showing we're tackling it? And there are other ways to deal with this. I come to the conclusion that they just don't like Medicaid, they being the federal government. And if you're going to be complicit on this and not speak up, this is a really important part. These are our dollars. They gave you a generalization of a fraud. They throw out numbers that now I see have been roundly discredited. And we can work on this together. The package I gave you, many of these are Republican ideas in that. So we hope that they would, the way we can fix this sooner is to ask the federal government to not do something that's never happened to any other state, that has no evidence behind it, is only going to hurt people, does nothing to improve fraud, and is just a petty attack on Minnesota. Just ask them to stop that. But I would say this to Minnesotans, we continue to work hard. We have a high quality of life here. We're making sure that your work pays off for you. And I think the important thing is, I think it got lost last year in the tragedies of Melissa and Mark's murder. It got lost in the Annunciation shooting. It got lost in a lot of things that happened. That legislative session last year is a model on how things should be done. It's a model on how to be fiscally responsible and take care of the things we should do. And it's a model on how an absolutely evenly divided legislature put the needs of Minnesota first and let the politics take a back seat. And I would encourage, if we keep that same attitude, if we come with those great ideas coming from both sides, if we see the leadership that was exhibited last year collectively, we can get this. So thank you all. Looking forward to it.